Hopefully you walk away from this answering the question of what the heck is MCP and why should you care about it. We'll talk a little bit in depth around the protocol itself, and then hopefully some information around how we at Anthropic think about agents and what the next few years might actually look like. So if you spent any time developing with LLMs or trying to get LLMs to do things on your behalf, you've probably run into the problem of context. So models out of the box are quite good. They can do some really neat things. But generally, when you're trying to solve a problem with an LLM, they're really only as good as the information that you give them. So with MCP, we're really trying to bridge this gap. At its core, MCP, or the Model Context Protocol, is an open protocol that standardizes how applications provide context to large language models. You can think of MCP as the sort of USB-C adapter for the ecosystem at large. It's really a standardized way to connect models to the different data sources and tools that you want your model to interact with. So a point of confusion sometimes, and something that we really want to hammer home and clarify, is that MCP is not an Anthropic product. MCP is an open source initiative. It's pioneered by Anthropic. We have a group of core maintainers whose primary responsibility is making sure that the model, the MCP, moves forward. But at the end of the day, all of the discussion, iteration, and development of MCP happens online in a public forum. Since we released it at the end of 2024, it's really taken off. It's really become very quickly the sort of standard in the ecosystem for integrating tools with LLMs. The other important piece is this is not just an Anthropic initiative. Very quickly, we've seen the other frontier labs and model providers adopt this as the sort of standard for agents and LLMs. So MCP is really a continuation of a rich, a long history of industry adopting, incubating, and codifying open protocols. So you're probably familiar with a handful of these protocols. You can see that the interesting thing is that the MCP timeline is really quite short. As I mentioned, this only released at the end of 2024. And what's really fun about MCP right now in the ecosystem is that it's very much in a nascent stage, right? So if you go and spend any time on GitHub in some of the discussion forums, you will see that we are really sort of actively working through some of the open questions around the ecosystem, how we should think about authentication, how we should think about communication transports. And so my plea to you would be, go spend some time thinking about some of these design patterns. Tell the rest of your engineering teams to go dig through some of the online discussions, because we really collectively have an opportunity to sort of define this for the next handful of years. So as I mentioned, it's only been a few short months, but we've already seen really cool industry adoption from some very savvy and tech-forward startups and organizations. So I want to dig into a little bit about how the protocol actually works and what it looks like. So at the highest level of the framework, we make the first major delineation between MCP clients and MCP servers. So similar to the way that in the traditional SDLC, we make the delineation between front-end and back-end engineers, we imagine that in the future, you might say that you are a server or client developer. So what are these actually responsible for? The client is, think of this as the way that you sort of manage the end user interaction. So the MCP client that I spend the most time in is Claude for Desktop, right? It's the standard chat interface. This connects to many MCP servers. And some of the core primitives of the protocol, tools, resources, and prompt templates, these are the things that both clients and servers manage and interact with. The server is responsible for exposing these primitives. The client is responsible for sampling and figuring out which tools to execute and when. Most developers today spend a lot of time in and around tools as the sort of core primitive. If you spent time developing with LLMs before MCP, this is a really natural extension of the way that we built around models. You can think of like function calling and its equivalent. Tools is really the way you do that in MCP. Admittedly, resources and prompt templates are less widely developed upon, but we think there are going to be some really interesting patterns and development best practices that emerge around resources and prompt templates. The other piece to be aware of from a design perspective is that we really think about tools being invoked by the client, and it's really sort of on the client to understand when it wants to invoke a certain tool, resources are really controlled and maintained and ultimately gated by the server. So again, this is really just a protocol. It is a standard definition for how LLMs can integrate with external data sources and tools. So to make this a little bit more tactical, you see on the left-hand side here, these are some of the most standard MCP clients that people are probably pretty familiar with. If you can imagine, put yourself in the shoes of any of these companies and startups, they're all thinking about the question of how do I get my LLM client to interact really reliably with external databases, CRM systems, for example, version control software like GitHub. You could think, all of the clients on that list, with the exception of Claude Desktop, some of the AI native IDEs, probably at one point were thinking through how do we get our system to work really well with GitHub. So they were all probably doing the same set of work, trying to build essentially a wrapper on top of the existing GitHub API. A much better way to do that, and what we can do today, is basically take the existing official MCP GitHub server, pull that down, or we can use their hosted version, and all MCP clients can now interact really reliably with GitHub and conduct actions on the end user's behalf. So I'll transition a little bit and talk about how we at Anthropic think about agents. So we spend a lot of time building with, developing, prototyping, thinking about agents. And one really interesting and kind of neat experiment that we've been running for the last year or so is around Pokemon. So you guys might have seen on Twitter or in some of our press releases, we spent a lot of time actually getting Claude to be really good at playing the game of Pokemon. So if you actually take a look, you can go watch Claude playing Pokemon on Twitch right now. But what's interesting is that it might seem like a bit of a toy example, right? Who really cares if the LLMs are good at playing Pokemon? But I think it's a really interesting testing ground and environment because to be good at Pokemon, you actually have to operate over a sufficiently large context. You need to go and explore the world. You need to go and catch Pokemon. You need to train them. You need to go and beat gyms. In order to be able to do this, you actually have to be able to manage the right amount of information over a really long context interaction. So we've spent a lot of time with our newest models building around tools like memory and figuring out how to make these systems perform well over these types of longer context interactions. The other thing about Pokemon that makes it particularly good is that it's ultimately like a single turn experience. You have some game state, you take an action, you get some update to that state, you can go and then make another action that is not dependent on you reacting quickly. So what does Pokemon have to do with MCP? Similar to the way that we at Anthropic have developed agents that go and play games, the ecosystem at large is thinking about how do we build agents that go and interact really reliably on our behalf in the larger digital ecosystem. So we think about MCP being a truly foundational protocol for agents because it basically standardizes the handshake that agents will make with the rest of the digital world. You could think about your agent going on your behalf and interacting with different knowledge bases or data stores. It could interact with external tools. It could also interact with other agents. And you probably want some mechanism for this thing to interact with your own personal context, history, or the context of your organization. MCP at the end of the day allows for all of these people to start speaking the same language so that LLM clients, or in this case agents, can go and interact with this world in a really standardized, authenticated, consistent manner. So the next hurdle for the ecosystem is really around discoverability. As we mentioned, we've seen a ton of interest in MCP more generally. What this means is that we got a ton of server developers pushing out products really quickly. The open question is, how do we figure out which ones are high quality? How do we figure out which ones adhere to the spec? How do we figure out which ones do authentication correctly? This is a sort of open question that we are thinking a lot about. It may be solved by us. It may be solved by a combination of startups and other people in the ecosystem. But this is a really interesting and open-ended question. Again, I'd implore everyone here to spend some time, go to the GitHub, see what people are thinking about. This is kind of the big open question that we're thinking about. So looking ahead a little bit, this is a really kind of mind-boggling chart. What you're seeing here is a handful of models, and the plot is basically saying On the y-axis, what is the amount of time denoted in sort of human hours that these models can reliably complete tasks? So if you think back to the GPT-2 or the GPT-3 days, these models, most of the time, could complete tasks that took a human, on average, a few seconds, right? Answer a simple question. This chart actually doesn't even show the latest series of models, but with Sonnet 3.7, our models were reliably completing tasks that took expert humans, on the order of a few hours. So this is a really, really wild chart, and it's a really strange time to be in AI. The takeaway here is that the length of tasks that these systems can do is doubling roughly every 7 months. So you might be familiar with the ARC AGI leaderboard. This is another really interesting public benchmark. The goal of ARC AGI is to essentially design tasks that test a model's ability to do abstract reasoning or sort of like generalized problem solving. It was released a few years ago, and you'll see very clearly the trend on this chart is up and to the right. And if you spent any time in technology, charts that go up and to the right also tend to go up and to the right for the foreseeable future. So this is another really interesting benchmark, just understanding how our lab, but also other frontier labs, are thinking about problems around abstract reasoning and abstract problem solving. So to sort of round this out, how do we think about future-proofing an organization in light of all these developments and the rate of change in the ecosystem? So there are a couple of key areas that we recommend folks think about. Models is the first. If you're in this room, you've probably suffered from a little bit of model fatigue over the last couple of years. The really interesting thing is that there are times when a new model family is released and we've got some sort of novel unlocked use case based on that delta in the intelligence frontier. Development standards. There's a sort of open discussion on my team at Anthropic about what exactly is the half-life or shelf life of some of the best practices for prompting and agentic architectures. And we think it's roughly like 8 months. So this is tricky because most businesses don't operate on this cadence. So we recommend the best way to sort of stay up to date on how to actually work with these systems is to pay attention to the content, the blogs, the cookbooks, the best practices coming out of our lab, but really all of the frontier labs. Obviously, we've talked a lot about MCP. We think that this is a really important piece of the ecosystem that you can adopt today to make your internal development standardized, as well as exposing your application to the ecosystem at large. Agents and workflows. I think the rule of thumb around this is if you can sufficiently describe the task and all of the possible edge cases and failure modes, you can probably get an LLM to do it. And lastly, the core business. We are pretty close to unlocking truly capable agentic systems. And I think the question to ask in each of your shoes is, what does my core business look like when I have highly capable systems operating inside and around my organization? So with that, I will leave you. Thank you all for joining us today.